Hello, my name is Dale Maley. Today we're going to talk about the process we're using to add the Strevell House to the National Register of Historic Places. If you're going to add a property to the National Register, one of the things is you have to understand the history of the property you're talking about that you want to add. So I got the idea, why not research and learn the history of the Strevell House first by writing a book about it. Then I could use that historical knowledge to fill out the application to add the house to the National Register of Historic Places. This slide depicts some of the sources that I used to write the book about the Strevell House. And I was fortunate I had a lot of research that Collins Miller had done. I also had research and documents about the project from Tom Ewing, and I got a lot of information from the Pantograph archives as well as Google Books, newspapers.com. Actually went to the old courthouse to find 1872 lawsuit and 1850 property taxes. I used the 1878 Livingston County history book. I also used a lockbox that we have at the bank because it has the abstract and title for the Strevell House at 401 West Livingston. Now, here's the timeline that I used for writing the book. As you can see, it really started with the July 22nd meeting in 2022 that we held at the Strevell House with Collins Miller, Tom Ewing, myself, and Joyce Nagel. And then it took me about 14 weeks to write the book, off and on, 200 pages. I decided to use 8.5 by 11 format. I used color versus black and white. There's 64,000 words in the book, and if you add up from the manuscript file, I spent 243 hours writing the book. And once proofreading was done and some lead time to order the first official copies, I got those on October 28th of 2022. I got the first 20 books. This is the beginning of the timeline for adding the Strevell House to the National Register. So that timeline, of course, starts with that first July 22nd meeting that we had at the Strevell House. Then by late September, the book was basically done, and I was waiting on printed copies from Amazon. So I found out you have to do a preliminary application with the state of Illinois, and they must pass you before you can fill out the federal application. So I did that, and then the official copies of the book first arrived on October 28th. Now, when I was filling out the preliminary application, I noticed one of the requirements is the property that you're trying to add must be more than 50 years old. It took me about 2 days to fill out the preliminary application, so I started on September 24th, and I sent that in September 26th. And that preliminary application was 4 pages long, plus photographs of the house. And it took until October 10th for the state of Illinois people to come back to me and say that my preliminary application was judged positive with respect to submitting the federal application. In other words, I could go ahead and start filling out the federal form. Once I was approved to start filling out the federal form, it was interesting that they gave me a document of consultants that we could hire. Most of them are Chicago architectural outfits. This is just a sampling. There was 4 pages of consultants. And I looked online, and you can spend anywhere from $5,000 up to $50,000 if you wanted to hire the whole process done of filling out the application and getting the property on the National Register. This is a portion of the instructions for adding the property to the National Register, and there's 4 ways to get on the National Register. They're shown on the left, A, B, C, and D. A is properties associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. B, property is associated with the lives of persons significant in our past. C is basically architecture. And D, the property is likely in the future to have important information about prehistory or history. Also notice that over on the right, they've got that criteria again that the property must be at least 50 years old. You only need one of the four to get on the National Register, and you can have more than one of the four to get on the register. So I had to decide for the Strevell House which of the four should I apply under. Now, going back to A, examples of criteria A would be our old City Hall in Fairbury, or the State Police Headquarters on Old 66 south of Pontiac. Criteria B is important people, and in our case we've got Lincoln and Strevell. C is architecture, and the Strevell House is definitely distinct architecture in that it's Carpenter Gothic. And then D, an example of D would be a rediscovered cemetery, for example. Our beach house in Pontiac was entered under criteria C, architecture. So I decided to go for both criteria B and C for the Strevell House. Now here's the major categories that's in the application. You have to give a narrative description of the property, then a summary paragraph. What environment and setting is the property? You have to talk about the exterior of the property, the interior of the property. Does it have integrity, which means does it still look the way it did when it was first built and was important? And then you have to have a statement of significance summary paragraph. Now, here are the remaining categories on the application. The politics and government around the property you're talking about, and they specifically said they wanted you have to include Native American history. So fortunately, I've previously researched the Indians in the area and even wrote a book about it, about Fairbury, Illinois, from prehistoric times to modern times. And I focused on the Kickapoo there because they were the last Native Americans in the area. Anyway, it was easy to do the Native American history because I'd already done that research. The architecture of the house, your major bibliography references, then photos of the exterior and interior of the structure, interior floor plans, and a site map. Now, during my research, I discovered that Zealous Nettleton, who built the Strevell House, he actually had built a Greek Revival house in Constantine, Michigan, before he moved to Pontiac. That home was placed on the National Register in 2020. So I was able to get a copy of that application, and I could use that information as a reference for how to do the application on the Strevell House. Now, in addition to building the Greek Revival house in Constantine, Michigan, Mr. Nettleton also built a Carpenter Gothic house. Now, that home is not on the National Register, but the architecture is described in the application for the Greek Revival house. So I could use that material to help describe the Carpenter Gothic architecture, which is used on the Strevell House. And as you can see on the views here, it has the same type of architecture on the windows and below the roof line. The house in Constantine, those features pretty much match up with the Strevell House. So I had to learn architecture. So here's Architecture 101 for you on the Strevell House. And some of the distinctive features of Carpenter Gothic architecture are shown here, which includes the window hoods around the top of the windows. They're called finial mini spires up on top, horizontal barge boards, the scroll sawn drop pendant barge boards. The east gable of the house is shifted, which gives the front an asymmetrical facade. and it still has the original wood siding with the original red paint. I finally got the federal application completed and submitted on October 13th of 2022. That application has a total of 54 pages. Now 22 of those pages are interior and exterior photos, which means there's 25 pages of text. So I submitted the application and I crossed my fingers. And my first attempt was a dismal failure. I crashed and burned. So, if you remember, for the Strevell House, I applied under two criteria. Criterion A, which was important people, and Criterion C was architecture. And the state people said that one visit by Abraham Lincoln to the house was not significant enough. So, that leaves Jason Strevell. So does the state of Illinois people, do they consider Jason Strevell as significant or not? So, I decided to summarize all the information I knew about Jason Strevell and then give that to the state of Illinois people and let them tell me, do you consider this guy significant or not? So it actually took 2 pages to get all the information I had because I'd written an entire book about his history. So let's just run through that. 1832, Mr. Strevell was born in Albany, New York. He got his law degree out there. 1855, moved to Pontiac. He practiced law. He ran a hardware store, one of the first businesses in Pontiac. In 1856, the village of Pontiac was incorporated. He was elected as a member of the first Board of Trustees. He helped establish Pontiac's Southside Public Cemetery. He and his wife helped establish the first Pontiac Presbyterian Church. He served as a Sunday school superintendent. He married the widower Elizabeth Butler in Pontiac. In 1860, he met and became friends with Abraham Lincoln. He was selected as a delegate to the Illinois State Republican Convention in Decatur, often called the Wigwam Convention. He voted to select Abraham Lincoln as Illinois' candidate for president. In 1864, he was elected as a member of the Illinois House of Representatives and served 2 terms. President Lincoln appointed him to work at the New Orleans Custom House. He tried that but ended up returning to Pontiac. In 1868, Mr. Strevell was elected to be an Illinois state senator, and he served 1 term. His most important legislation was in 1871 when he got Pontiac to be the site of the new Boys State Reformatory. Later that became the Pontiac Correctional Center, and has been one of Pontiac's largest employers for over 150 years. In 1876, he was selected as a member of the Electoral College for the 1876 presidential election. That was one of the most contentious elections ever held in the United States. In 1879, they moved to Miles City, Montana. He was a pioneer member of that city and practiced law. He helped establish their Presbyterian church. In 1888, he was appointed to be a probate judge in Montana. And he died in 1903 and was worth over $6 million in today's dollars. Now, here's the response that I got back from the woman at the state of Illinois. She said, yes, the significance of the property for its architecture is sufficient for nominating the property. In other words, it meets one of the 4 criteria. But for the second criteria, important people, she has, he appears to be significant, but to argue that for National Register significance would require a deeper dive into his accomplishments. Well, I wrote a complete book about the guy. I summarized everything about him in the last 2 pages, some information. And she says basically that's not enough. Well, I don't know what else there is to find because I found everything I can about this guy. So, at this point in the process, here's what I concluded. The Strevell House does indeed meet criteria C for architecture. and Mr. Strevell might meet criteria A as a historic person, but the state of Illinois is saying more research about him is required, and I've already thoroughly researched him, so there is no more information to find. And you only need one criteria to get on the National Register. You don't need two. So why not just drop criteria A, the historic person, and proceed on for criteria C, architecture. So on November 20th, 2022, I sent in revision number 1. Crossed my fingers, and I hoped that the second time around was going to be a charm. This time I was successful. On December 16th, the state of Illinois approved my application. They only made a couple of minor changes. So I was approved, and then they told me that February 24th of 2023 was the next time the state board met. They would meet then and then vote on accepting my application at the state level, and then the last step was going to the director out in Washington, D.C. So I sat back and thought, boy, I don't really have to do anything now until February 24th. I can relax for a little while. My relaxation period did not last very long, though, because on January 19th, I got notified that I needed to provide information so the state could send a notification form out that the house was being considered to be added to the National Register. So I had to provide the name of and addresses of the house owner, which was easy since it's a historical society. But I had to figure out who the mayor of Pontiac was and who the president of the county board was. So I provided that information on January 19th. Then on February 7th, just a short time before the big review meeting, I got a request to make a presentation up for the review board, and it would be a WebEx meeting. And I was given choices that I could prepare that presentation and present it. Amy of the state could prepare and present it, and I went back and said, how about I prepare it and Amy presents? And my rationale was I don't want to have a computer problem over WebEx and prevent me from presenting and then mess up the whole project. So if she presented, I was going to present, I was sure that she would be successful. The review meeting was held February 24th. I called in via WebEx, and when it got to the Strevell House, there was like 7 properties they considered that day. Amy gave my presentation. She did a very good job. There was only a few comments and a couple of questions. I answered one question. So the 12 or 13 members of that group all voted to approve my application. Here's a graphical way of showing the process that we've gone through so far, starting in July of last year when we had the Strevell House meeting. Got the preliminary application done, submitted the first federal application, got rejected, submitted the first revision, got accepted there. I had to provide some notification information. I had to make up the presentation for the big review meeting. The state of Illinois approved that. On March 6th, they mailed or sent my application to the last remaining person in Washington, D.C., and that person has 45 days to respond, which would make it about April 20th on a decision. So hopefully, before the end of April, we'll get a decision that the house has successfully been added to the National Register. So it turns out it was a good idea to learn the history of the Strevell House by first researching and writing a book about it. The toughest parts so far in the process were learning the architectural vernacular, and architects have their own language, like most professions do, for explaining the architecture of the Strevell House. Another thing I struggled with on the application was the meaning of significance and integrity. I'm hoping to get final approval then by this summer, and then when that does happen, we'll have to get a plaque and have a big celebration. Hope everyone enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.